Hi, this is Shambhavi. Welcome to my weekly podcast about spirituality, love, death, devotion, and waking up while living in a messy world. The Satsang with Shambhavi podcast is recorded live each week with students of our nonprofit community, Jaya Kula. For more information and to find out about attending a satsang, visit jayakula.org. Thanks for listening. Much love to you, wherever and however you are. I wanted to start with a short teaching about sadhana. I'm going to read two quotes. The first one's from Rumi, and it's a pretty famous quote. Submit to a daily practice. Your loyalty to that is a ring at the door. Keep knocking, and the joy inside will eventually open a window and look out to see who's there. And I'll talk about this in a minute. And then this is from Ma, and this is just one of many different, Anandamayi Ma, for those who might not know. That's who I mean when I say Ma. She gave this teaching a lot in many different forms, so this is just one that I found. Take God's name and stick to it. Do not be disheartened. You never know when the moment will come for you to realize His grace. Try to devote as much time to the Lord as you can. And this is about doing japa, about doing mantra practice. So in many forms and many different ways, she gave the teaching that we should just do our practice, and then the moment when we might become open to wisdom, aka grace, the moment when we might become more open, or the moments when we become more open to the direct experience of our real nature, are really not up to us. We can't plan for that. We can't power through to that. We can't guarantee when that is going to happen. We only know that if we keep doing our sadhana, putting one foot in front of the other, that it will happen at some point or another. And also not all at once necessarily in some giant event, but incrementally as we go along, with maybe the occasional giant event. But each of us comes in a very unique condition. We are each have this totally unique dimension, and this relates directly to when are we going to experience spiritual opening. Or let's say we're just going along and we have had access to grace and devotion and wisdom, all the same thing. And then we have a really dry spell. That just happens to every single person if you keep going. So those dry spells can last days or weeks or months or years, or I presume longer. And of course, this was written about by St. John of the Cross, and it's not special to Hindu traditions, when he wrote about the dark night of the soul. So if you are a dedicated practitioner and you're going along every day, you're going to run into these periods that are very dark, where you feel like you've lost contact with God, and it's very painful. And the absolute way out of it is to just keep practicing. And what happens during those periods, having been through a couple of them myself, I can tell you, what happens is you gain incredible patience, humility, modesty, fortitude. At the end of it, you're closer to God than you were before. You have more capacity to rest in living presence than you did before, because it's a necessary stripping process, stripping of pride, stripping of fantasy, etc. And instilling of the number one quality of those types of episodes is modesty. So that's really what I wanted to talk about, that we so lack modesty in our culture, and we have a feeling of humiliation. That is not modesty. So we have humiliation and we have pride, and we want to accomplish. We want to feel proud of ourselves because of our accomplishments, because we're afraid of being humiliated. And we're afraid of really opening up because we're afraid of being disappointed. So in place of actually opening, in place of actual modesty, we have this switchback between pride and humiliation, between accomplishment and failure. We label things this way. There is no failure. There actually is no accomplishment either. So most of us, if not all of us, approach our spiritual practice as We want to be good at it. We want to be great at it. We want to have certain kinds of experiences. And we want it to happen now. I posted that quote from Buffy the Vampire Slayer on our community Slack, where Anya the ex-demon says, "I was being patient. It just took too long." And I think this is the attitude that a lot of us have. We have no sense of the scale of the spiritual journey to awakening in our culture, because our fear of humiliation, our fear of disappointment causes us to want everything to be accomplished very, very quickly so that we can run away from those feelings. And when we sit down to do practice, none of those things are helping us. One of the lessons I had to learn as a teacher, and I'm probably still learning it, is that stories from my own teachers or stories of other teachers that I never met, of their spiritual experiences, how they gained insights, how they practiced, that inspired me greatly and moved me and caused me to want to practice more. For some people in our culture, make it more difficult to practice, because then you're measuring yourself against others and you feel lesser than. This just completely blindsided me when I finally realized what was happening. Sometimes a student would say to me, if I shared my own spiritual experience, that they felt badly. And I was really taken aback by this, because the only reason I shared was because of my experience feeling inspired by those things when my teacher shared them. So somehow we need to be okay just sitting down and doing our practice without the expectation that we put on ourselves that we have to have a certain kind of experience. And what can we do in its place so that in the absence of whatever we think we should be experiencing, we can enjoy what we actually are experiencing? So one thing that I've recommended so many times is that we make a beautiful place to practice in, that we have a place to sit down that magnetizes us, that we really want to go there and do that practice just for the pleasure of being in that space. I think that's really important. And then to just enjoy the bare bones of our practice, the sound of mantra, the grace of the movements that we're doing if we're making offerings, the small details, the textures, the sounds, the smells. We have to be okay, and we have to let ourselves be satisfied with the small pleasures that are always there for us when we're practicing. I think there's an analogy here to, I've done a lot of writing in my life, and of course, also being someone who hangs out in cafes a lot, I met a lot of people who wanted to be writers, but they didn't write, or they were afraid to write. And why is this? Because they wanted to be good writers. They wanted to be accomplished writers. And of course, you can't just sit down and write and be that. And what is the difference between someone who wants to do something but only wants to do it or only can sustain it if they feel like they're being good at it or accomplishing something, versus someone who's just willing to plunge in there and do it regardless? The difference is enjoyment. The difference is enjoyment. So whatever we can do to enjoy whatever is happening in our sadhana is very, very important, I think. As a writer, I always loved the process of writing, and even the magicalness of words appearing, even when I was using a typewriter, but especially when computers came around. I am that old that I started out on a typewriter. But just like when you would type and the words would just appear over there, but even more so, the computer, the magicalness of those words and the way, the fluidity that the computer introduced with writing, where you could just move things around this very organic way. And this is directly, I think, applicable to our sadhana. I was really entranced with personal computers when they first came around. I would sit and literally feel the texture of the plastic and the feeling of the smoothness of the keys under my fingers and the sound of the keys, the smell even. Computers at that time, I don't think they have a smell now, but they used to, like a new car of some sort, right? And just the visual and the shape of them and everything. I mean, I just enjoyed the whole thing. And so that was there for me to sort of distract me from this goal-oriented aspect of it, right? That I could just enjoy it. And then, of course, I also love words. So I just loved making words and making words sound a certain way and all that. But there were other enjoyments that were a little less obvious than liking language. So in whatever way you can make your experience of doing sadhana about texture and smell and movement and just being in a space and maybe the sounds coming in from outside and the light and the feeling of the beads moving over your fingers and whatever you can do, you know, the curl of the smoke. If you can just like focus on that stuff instead of on what you are failing at, then you are going to be much more in line with the teachings of all the great teachers about how we should approach sadhana. Chogyam Trungpa said, "You are just a person sitting in a room. That should be your attitude." Well, that could work for somebody, but I think it's too austere for us. We need something more powerful to magnetize ourselves away from this feeling that we should be feeling something we're not. We're not doing it right. We're failing at it. Or the opposite, fantasizing, making fantasies out of spiritual experiences to assuage our fear of humiliation and failure. So whatever we're doing, this is almost universal. And it's a huge obstacle for us. And it deters people from doing practice. Sometimes it makes people feel very sad and depressed about doing practice. And we should understand that whatever condition we're in, this is the condition we were put in by God, and we should work with it and just be as simple as we possibly can and use enjoyment to be nourished by what we're doing when we are just being ordinary plain practitioners. I mean, all over the world, people do not need these things, I think. I mean, there are beauties to spiritual practice everywhere, of course. Even just a simple mala is very, very beautiful to me anyway. But there's just a lot more modesty in other cultures. It doesn't seem like a failure to just be an ordinary practitioner going along doing your thing. The expectations of what's going to happen to you as a practitioner aren't so high. No one expects to have these great accomplishments or great breakthroughs. They're just doing their thing. And I don't know what their attitude is, but it's definitely not one of failure, right? Because they didn't have some great experience. So use enjoyment in whatever way you possibly can. I mean, I listed some of the things that I enjoy, the sensory experiences when I'm doing practice, but you might have other ones that you can think of. But try to enjoy what is happening exactly as it's happening, not as you wish it were happening. Right?
Hi, I just on this topic, it makes me think about the morning worship and the evening worship and how I feel like I know some people have other associations with that word, but I really like it. And I feel like worship and prayer kind of are the same thing as practice, but there's almost something semantic about practice that hooks into a tiding thing of like practice makes perfect. Every time I see that particular statement, it kind of drives me crazy because I feel like we don't practice for perfection, or that's not the view of this tradition.
Well, I just want to say that I've never thought of that phrase, practice makes perfect, in relationship to the word practice meaning sadhana. So I don't think there's anything inherently tighten about it. That's all.
About the word.
Yeah. Discipline is good. And that also is not the same as tighten attitude. Right? But to become perfect would be, as you said, not in the view of this tradition, because the view of this tradition is we are already perfect. And we're just trying to discover that. And that's why there's nothing to accomplish. Right. And in fact, it could be said that we're de-accomplishing our karmas. That's all we're doing, de-accomplishing.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about our ancestors. And I don't really know who my ancestors are. There are very few photographs. And I think just for such a long time, I've always just thought of more sort of like an austere patriarchal kind of lineage. And also like in all of the family trees and all the taxonomies in my family, all the women are sort of like marked by X's, while the men have names that the women are marked by X's.
Well, in terms of relating, like if you wanted to relate more to the women in your ancestral line, I think that a good thing to do would just be to sit and ask to do that silently from the heart and see what comes to you. Not necessarily in the form of particular stories, but a feeling, right? And maybe that's just my way of relating to things, but I feel like I get direction and certain feelings and help from my spiritual lineages that I don't even know who they are. I just feel their presence, and most of them are women. I don't know who they are, and I don't try to know who they are. I just try to directly connect and receive help from them, mostly in the form of okay. So I would suggest that, like a more sort of general, just open to feel what's there and feel what comes to you. And then in the matter of like our ancestors and their souls, this tradition and none of the traditions that I've studied in really have a concept of a soul. It's like we are a kind of a condensation, a localized, individual-esque kind of phenomenon that is totally open to everything. And there are different lives feeding into this. So our direct ancestral line is one aspect of what's feeding into this, but it's not just that. It's, countless lives that we've encountered and experiences that have kind of accrued to whatever this temporary phenomenon is. And so there's patterns also that make this up. We can call those patterns in a gross way genetics, and then there's epigenetics, but that would only be a very small fraction of what this is composed of, this totally open phenomenon. So what we would say is that there's a simultaneity of all lives living in Maha time, and that when we connect with specific ancestors, for instance, we might be connecting with that. But there's also the way that certain patterns can survive. So if we have an ancestor, let's say, who their life was characterized by many, many acts of kindness and generosity, that's a very strong pattern. So we might open and discover a feeling of that coming toward us because we're really connected to that in linear time. So there's both the linear time connection with ancestors, that is what I just described, that there's patterns that actually survive and go on to survive in the phenomenon of linear time that may or may not be in human bodies, but really that isn't of much moment to us at this stage of practice, whether they're in human bodies or not. But if we have very beneficent qualities in our ancestors that can help us, and I always assume that if we have a strong samskara for doing sadhana, and you have this very beautiful devotional quality, capacity, that despite all your intellect and everything, that comes from somewhere, right? That's like a gift to you. And I'm assuming that you have ancestors that also felt that. And maybe you had ancestors who were able to devote more time to practice and didn't have the conflicts that you experience. And maybe you could get help from them to clarify the purpose of your life and to support you in doing what your heart really desires to do. So those are all linear time experiences. But then there's Maha time, where those lives are just being lived. We don't really know what our relationship is to them particularly, but we can also get help in that way, especially from our spiritual preceptors that we had at other times or that we're connected to for some way or another. Satsang with Shambhavi is produced by Jaya Kula. a nonprofit community offering opportunities to learn and practice in the direct realization traditions of Trika Shaivism and Dzogchen. If you enjoyed listening, please help us keep this podcast and many other teachings open to all by making a monthly or one-time donation. Visit jayakula.org to make a donation and explore more of our offerings.